Hello, my name is Peter Jones. I'm Professor of Psychiatry from the University of Cambridge in England. My research interests are mainly in schizophrenia and psychotic disorders and trying to understand their causes using epidemiological models. I also do some treatment research, and clinically I'm involved in a first episode early intervention service called Cameo, where we treat young people from their mid-teens to their mid-30s who are experiencing a first episode of a psychotic disorder. So I try and link my clinical and research interests in that way. Epidemiological study from the UK, and it's been a very interesting experience for me preparing for this lecture, because a lot of our findings about bipolar disorder are hidden in different papers, and I want to try and understand why that might be. So before we begin thinking about the findings from this study, I just want to spend a little time on this question about what is a case. And I'm particularly interested in this in terms of a wider phenotype of psychotic disorders. And I come from the background of psychotic disorders to think about bipolar disorder, and I know that that's quite different from many psychiatrists who come from the context of mood disorder. And I tend to think of this as a psychosis, perhaps because if I speak to someone with bipolar disorder for long enough, I think you can always find that they have some element of psychosis or thought disorder. So for psychosis we have a syndrome, a collection of features that tend to occur together, and this is a figure from Nancy Andreasen where on the left she puts the symptoms and on the right the system of the brain or the mind that is going wrong to generate the symptom. And there are the positive symptoms of psychosis, negative, and we mustn't forget the movement disorder and cognitive disorder, which is a part of a psychotic syndrome. And of course, a lot of the concern about diagnosis is about one single feature of this syndrome, the affective component, which really controls a lot of the diagnostic decisions within all operational criteria, whether ICD or DSM. So these are the syndromes we see in clinical practice, but it's much more complicated when you go out into the population. And we've known for a long time that some of these individual symptoms are very common in the general population. So these are quite old data from the epidemiological catchment area study in North America, published in 1991, that's showing that up to 10% of Americans have paranoid symptoms. 5% are hearing other people talking when there's no one around. These were so surprising 20 years ago that these findings didn't really have very much impact. But of course, over the past 10 years, we increasingly understand that parts of psychiatric syndromes are very common in the population. And these are some data from a PhD student of mine who has done a study in Chile, in South America, in the inner city part of Santiago. And what she's done here, this is a survey of about 1,200 people, half of them are women. These are just the data for the women. And these are the numbers of symptoms in something called the clinical interview schedule, which is a depression and anxiety schedule, a neurotic symptom schedule. And this is the prevalence, the percentage of people, of women who have no neurotic symptoms, 1 neurotic symptom, 2, 3, 4. And what she's done is to colour the part of the bar, the proportion where people also have psychotic symptoms. And you can see that there's a very close relationship in the population between psychotic symptoms and depression and anxiety. As psychiatrists, we think that they're very different, but I think we will understand more in the next 5 to 10 years that in the population, people just have symptoms. They have depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, hallucinations, strange beliefs. Everything is out there. So things, I think, for research and epidemiology will become more complicated over the next few years as we understand this. And of course, the same is true for bipolar disorder, with Jules Angst showing that part of the clinical syndrome of bipolar is very common in the general population, and a degree of bipolarity of mood is very common. But I'm going to come back and talk about the clinical syndromes that we're more familiar with and that we see in clinical practice. And as Madame Laboyer said, I'm going to talk to you particularly about a single English study called the Aesop study. And a lot of what I tell you about comes from this paper, published by James Kirkbride, who was here, I think, last year, about 5 years ago now. And this gives the best description of the Aesop study. This took place in 3 cities in England. This is a rather strange map of England without Scotland or Wales. So this is devolution gone to the extreme. And this is a city called Nottingham, which is a post-industrial city in the Midlands of England. This is Bristol, which is a port on the Bristol on the River Severn. And this is Greater London, and this area here in southeast London is around the Maudsley Hospital. So these were the 3 parts of the population that were studied in the Aesop study. And this was started by the UK Medical Research Council, the main medical research funding body, that was very concerned about differences in incidence in different migrant groups, black and minority ethnic groups in England, and commissioned this 3-centre study to try and understand this phenomenon further. So that's where the title, the name Aesop, comes from. It's etiology and ethnicity in schizophrenia and other psychoses. And Aesop, of course, it's a nice name for a study like this, given Aesop, the Abyssinian slave who wrote the fables. The study covered about 1.6 million people, looking at the age 16 to 64 years over 2 years, and collected all the cases of clinically relevant psychotic disorders presenting for the first time, including non-psychotic mania. So we defined mania as a psychotic disorder, if you like. And we tried very hard to find all the cases, so those who remained in primary care, those who went into private hospitals, state hospitals, and who remained in outpatient clinics. The individuals were diagnosed using the SCAN interview, PSE-10, and ICD-10 diagnoses were made by a panel of clinicians who didn't know anything else about the patients. They were blind to their ethnicity and socio-demographic factors. And the study also involved a group of healthy controls randomly collected from these populations. So this figure shows what first episode psychosis is in England, what the broad diagnoses are. And the important thing that we learnt, and that was important for our services, was that first episode psychosis is not just schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, this proportion of all the diagnoses, is a little over 1/3 of all first episode psychosis. About another third here is affective psychosis, so depressive psychosis and bipolar disorder. And then another third are other diagnoses. And that's a very important group because we will get a lot of change in those diagnoses over time. And in fact, as I'll finish with, we've just completed a 10-year follow-up of this cohort, which we're analysing now. And we can be quite certain that a lot of people in this group will have moved into schizophrenia, and many of them will have moved into bipolar disorder. But there will also be people who were bipolar at the beginning of the study who now have schizophrenia, and some who had schizophrenia and now we're quite sure we had bipolar disorder. And that's also a very important finding, I think, that just like genetically these syndromes are linked, they are clinically as well. Their natural histories are not pure. So how common is bipolar disorder? And I've specifically defined bipolar disorder as mania with psychosis or mania without psychosis, and whether or not there was any particular type of depression beforehand. Because in ICD you get bipolar disorder with an episode of mania. This is the answer to how common bipolar disorder is in England in these three centres. So taking into account age of the populations, it's 4 per 100,000 per year. And very similar in men and women, perhaps a little bit more common in women, but that's below the resolution of our statistics. So if it is more common, the rate ratio is about 1.2, something like that. So much more common than depression, much more similar. And there are some socio-demographic characteristics about the incidence. It was higher than in London than the other centres, and I'll come back to that. So 4 per 100,000 per year, is that common? Or is it a rare disorder? If we look at a comparison, this is data from a systematic review of all incidence studies in England published over 50 years that includes the ESOP study. These are pooled incidence rates per 100,000 per year, and these are different diagnostic groups. So this is all psychoses, which is about 30 per 100,000 per year. This is schizophrenia, which is about 15 per 100,000 per year. And look at bipolar disorder. So it's very precisely defined, but the bipolar disorder is quite a rare disorder compared with first onset schizophrenia. And of course, that's one reason that makes it difficult to study in terms of causal research on first episode cases. It's rare. In a study like this that cost many millions of pounds, we don't get many first episode people with first episode bipolar disorder. So it's a disorder that's common in clinical practice because it's relapsing and remitting and its prevalence is high, but the incidence is much lower than schizophrenia or other psychoses in the biggest study that's been done in England. It may vary. So that was an interesting thing to find out about bipolar disorder, the precision of the estimate of incidence and knowing that it's much rarer than schizophrenia. What about when in the life course bipolar disorder begins? Well, there are several studies which give data about this, and the ESOP study is one of them. And what I've got here are 3 different figures of age at onset, with age along this axis and the proportion of all cases along this axis. And this figure here is for all psychoses, all psychotic disorders. This is schizophrenia or non-affective psychosis, and this is affective psychosis. So if you compare these two, this is the very familiar age at onset figure for schizophrenia. So a massive increase in incidence in the teenage years into the early 20s, then becoming more rare. Even this little increase where it becomes more common in women, possibly around the menopause, and a higher incidence for schizophrenia in men than women in the younger age groups. So this is all very familiar. But if you look at the one for affective psychoses, the figure is much more chaotic. It goes up and down, and that's because there are so few cases, I think. So it's unstable. But the pattern is very similar for affective psychotic disorders as for schizophrenia. So these affective psychoses are also disorders of the late teenage years and early adult life. So there's a very important effect of puberty in somehow determining the age at which these disorders begin. That's some information from the ESOP study about the amount of disorders and when they occur, and comparing schizophrenia with bipolar disorder. What about place, where these disorders begin? And this is something that we're particularly interested in Cambridge. So we'll come back to this strange map and the 3 centres. And once again, if we looked at all psychotic disorders combined and looked at the 3 centres of London, Nottingham and Bristol, and that's the combined figure, you can see that there are big differences between these 3 centres in England. One is part of a very large city, so a highly urban inner city area, and the other 2 are whole cities, so the whole of Nottingham and the whole of Bristol. So it includes the richer parts and the poorer parts. The London centre is a very small area which is predominantly deprived socially. So if we have a look at this London centre, there's the River Thames, and this is this area of catchment. If we have a look at that in more detail, you can divide up any area into smaller areas, and these are what we call electoral wards. So in each one of these areas, about 5,000 people live and vote, so they're used politically. And what my colleague James Kirkbride and others in the group did was to look at the spatial distribution in these areas of new incident cases in different diagnoses. And this map is based on a Bayesian approach, so it's about probability. And if you have this colour, you have the average, or your highest probability is to have the average rate of schizophrenia. If you are pale, then you have a lower than average, and these dark red are higher than average rates of schizophrenia. And you can see that there is a pattern here, that the distribution is not equal everywhere. And in fact, some of these wards, like this one here, it's called Cold Harbour, and everyone who's ever worked or lived in this area will know Cold Harbour as a very deprived area with a lot of high-rise housing estates. And this has what might be the highest incidence of schizophrenia that's ever been measured. I don't know whether it's the highest incidence of schizophrenia anywhere, probably not, but it's the highest measured rate of nearly 300 cases per 100,000 people per year in this small area. So for schizophrenia in South London, there's a pattern. But if you look at affective psychoses, there is no pattern. It's flat. And this isn't just about statistical power. It is about statistical power if we look at bipolar disorder alone, which is about half of these affective psychoses. We don't have enough cases. But if we look at all affective psychoses, the spatial map is very different from schizophrenia for some reason. So this seemed quite a new finding for us, and it was very different from the idea that schizophrenia has the same incidence everywhere in the world, which was an idea that was common in England, certainly 15 years ago, and that came from the World Health Organization 10-country study. So when I was learning psychiatry, I was taught that schizophrenia has the same incidence everywhere in the world, and we've just shown that that's not the case. But this has been known actually for a long time. This is a book, it's published in English, American English. Has anyone ever read this book? It's a wonderful book. Lots of copies are available on the internet because libraries are now selling off their stock. The authors are Faris and Dunham. And Faris and Dunham were social scientists from Chicago in the early 20th century. And Chicago has a very strong school of social medicine, social sciences and medicine. So what Faris and Dunham did from 1920 to 1930 was to do exactly the same as we did in the ESOP study. They counted cases over a longer period, 10 years, of all the neuropsychiatric disorders that arose in the public health system in Chicago from 1920 to 1930. And this is a map of Chicago. This is the coast, and on this side is water. It's Lake Michigan. And this is the city of Chicago. And it has what they call an ecological structure, in that the middle part of the city is the poorest part, and as you move out towards the periphery, it gets richer, more socioeconomically advantaged. And this is the map that Faris and Dunham drew in the 1930s about paranoid schizophrenia. And it's quite a good definition of paranoid schizophrenia that they had then, that we would recognize today. And this is high incidence in the dark, and this is low incidence. And you can see, without any statistics, with no Bayesian statistics, that there is a pattern here, and that the incidence of schizophrenia seems to be higher in these poorer inner city areas. So that's the same as we found in the ESOP study. They had lots of cases, and they were also able to do the same for manic depression or bipolar disorder. And just as we found in Southeast London, their map of the incidence of bipolar disorder is relatively flat. Again, it doesn't have the same area distribution, the same spatial distribution as schizophrenia. So there's a difference here between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder in terms of the link with small areas, which we think may be capturing socio-economic parts of causes to these disorders. Just to pull this section together then, so all of first episode psychosis is quite broad. It's not just schizophrenia. and it's not just bipolar disorder. New psychotic illness is uncommon, but bipolar disorder is much more rare, much less common than schizophrenia, and that makes research in bipolar disorder much more difficult. Both schizophrenia and bipolar have the same age at onset distribution. Schizophrenia is more common in men, but affective psychosis and bipolar disorder is much more equal. And there are differences in the way that schizophrenia and bipolar disorder vary by place and geography. Now, briefly, I wanted to mention migration, and I know my colleague James Kirkbride talked about migration last year, but we tend to think of migration as migration and schizophrenia in England, and this finding that schizophrenia is more common in migrant groups is, in England, it's very politically contentious. It's a difficult thing to talk about. And there are all sorts of possible reasons given as to why this might be a mistake caused by bias. But actually, nearly all the many studies that have ever looked at this show that schizophrenia is more common in migrant groups. And this is from a systematic review by Cantor Gray and colleagues. Each one of these rows is a different study of migration and schizophrenia in different countries around the world. And the effect is shown as this vertical notch. And on this side of the black line, the study shows that schizophrenia is more common in a migrant group. On this side of the line, it's less common. And these are the confidence limits. And you can see that nearly all the studies that have ever been done in the world show that schizophrenia is more common in migrant groups. And as I said, this was part of the reason that the Medical Research Council in England started the ESOP study to try and understand this. And our migrant group at the time that was suffering from this epidemic came from the Caribbean, a post-colonial migration from the Caribbean in the 1940s to the 1960s. So one of our first analyses in the ESOP study was to look at the incidence of schizophrenia according to ethnic groups. And we used the white European as a comparison, and these were the important ethnic groups in those 3 cities that we studied. And when we looked at the different ethnic groups, there were slightly raised rates of schizophrenia in South Asians and non-British white people, but in African Caribbeans and African people, the rate ratio was much higher. These are very high rates of schizophrenia. So this was confirming what we knew and what was worrying people. But what we were also able to show was that it was just the same for mania. And it wasn't just about the African Caribbean community in England. This was a rather more broad phenomenon for migrant groups. And this was a very important finding because schizophrenia is the most stigmatizing mental illness linked with a group with social disadvantage. And we were able to show that this is about severe mental illness more generally and not just about a single migrant group. So mania was more common in these migrants as well. So this is a similarity between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So we've got some similarities, some differences. The migration phenomenon seems to be the same, virtually the same, for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So why is that? 20 years ago, it was thought that this was probably a genetic phenomenon or some sort of neurological predisposition. And there were theories that many of you will remember about exposure to influenza in young mothers from overseas who hadn't been exposed to some viruses like influenza before. That may predispose. But we now know that the incidence of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder is the same in the islands that people came from, as it is in the white European population in England. In some islands, over half of the population migrated, so this isn't a selective migration phenomenon. We know that this risk does not go down generations vertically. It spreads horizontally in families, so it's about brothers and sisters having a high incidence of schizophrenia, not mothers, fathers, grandparents. So it's not a genetic transmission. And the developmental histories of migrants in England who get severe mental illness are often much better than those in the background population. So the whole emphasis has turned to psychosocial events and triggering factors, and what is the experience of being a migrant within a minority within a host community. And I think this is very interesting because it's occurring at the time when the whole, certainly in Britain, the whole concept of stress is becoming much more acceptable to talk about in biological psychiatry, because biological psychiatry now has mechanisms to think about it. It doesn't have to use psychoanalytic theory. So we know now about priming of dopaminergic and glucocorticoid receptor systems by stress. We know about epigenetic effects. We know how the HPA axis can become programmed by early life stress. And we know about interactions between life events and genetic factors. And of course, that's what's driving the EU gene environment interaction study that we're involved in here and in Cambridge and in London. So what does the ESOP study tell us about the effects, the potential effects of early life stress and this migration phenomenon? Separation from parents is a very traditional stress in psychology, isn't it? So parental separation. And we collected in the ESOP study information on separation from parents. And here we've got all the patients with, I think these are all psychoses, as to whether they were separated from their mother or separated from their father for 1 year or more, so a long separation. And we're now comparing with healthy community controls. And right at the right-hand side, that's the relative risk, the adjusted odds ratio for becoming psychotic if you have been separated from your mother or your father. And you can see that that exposure is associated with about a 2 times risk, twofold risk, doubling the risk. So let's look at that a little bit further and just now take separation from father as an example. And what's now been done is to separate the white British patients and the Afro-Caribbean patients and controls. And if you do that, you can see that the relative risk of psychosis, if you've been separated from your father for more than a year, is about the same in the white British group and the migrant group. So the causal force is the same in the two groups. But if you look in the controls, this is percent at how common being separated from your father is. In the white British, it's 18%. In the Afro-Caribbean, it's 32%. So this shows something quite interesting in terms of this potential causal factor or part of a cause, that the cause isn't different in the migrant group, it's just much more common. And that's probably what we're looking at in this phenomenon of increased risk in migrant groups, that the causes are not any different from other communities, but they're more common. You have a concentration of causes in one migrant group. So I think we can begin to penetrate or discuss the effects of place and migration on risk of both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. That some of the effects are to do with the people, some of them are to do with the interactions between people or social cohesion, and some of it is to do with people moving place, and that's really what migration is. And it's going to be very complicated, and I think it'll be a challenge to understand fully, but we're beginning to be able to separate out parts of this phenomenon. Just as an aside, these effects we found for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder in migrant groups are really very, very important. So it's not just that it's politically and socially important, they're very important for health services. I mean, clearly these illnesses have an effect on individuals, but migrant groups often, they may have fewer resources to deal with serious illness. If you look in public health terms at the effect on migrant communities, we can calculate that about 15 to 20% of all schizophrenia and bipolar disorder in the UK might be linked to or attributable to whatever the causes of this increased risk is. And if you look in any migrant group, and particularly in the African Caribbean migrant group in the UK, up to 85% of the schizophrenia and bipolar disorder that is suffered by that community will be being caused by whatever is causing the difference between the white community and the migrant community. So this is taking the effect on migrant communities is very severe, and I think demands attention and further research. So just to summarise what's happening in migration, it looks as though the link is very strong for both bipolar and schizophrenia. Most of the evidence we have is about what are sometimes called visible migrant groups. If we could understand this link between migration and mental illness, we would know a lot about the causes of psychotic disorders in general. And we know that social and developmental factors such as parental separation are important to build some kind of life course model of causation. And we know that mental health services need to take this into account when they are being designed and in day-to-day practice. Now, the last area of findings from the ESOP study I wanted to talk about, comparing schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, is cognition. And everyone will know that cognition has become a very active area of research, and the part of that activity has been driven by the desire to find drugs that improve cognition and drugs that don't lower cognition. So the pharmaceutical industry has driven quite a lot of this research, even though that we don't yet have any drugs that will reliably improve cognition. So there is some work from the ESOP study on cognition. We did a cognitive test battery on as many of the cases as we could, not the whole 560, but on around about 2/3 of them. And summarising from this paper I've just shown you, there are some remarkable findings for bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. This is quite a complicated summary figure. So each one of these sets of marks is a different area of cognition. It doesn't really matter what the details are, but these are tests of learning and memory, tests of verbal intelligence, processing speed, a number of tests of executive function and working memory, language fluency, and visuospatial function. And the these are comparisons between the diagnostic groups and the healthy controls. And for each test, the comparison is made with the healthy control group, with the mean in the healthy controls being this horizontal line here, the 0. And these are effect sizes or standard deviation. So this is below the mean and this is above the mean. And the two groups to concentrate on are this blue group, which is schizophrenia. And again, you don't need any statistics to show you that the schizophrenia group are scoring poorly in virtually every area of every domain of cognition. And in some of these areas, such as executive functioning, the effect size is huge. This is a very profound effect. I see in September you have my colleague from Oxford, Guy Goodwin, coming to speak to you, and he calls schizophrenia psychosis with a head injury. So here's the head injury of schizophrenia. Whereas if you look at bipolar disorder, then none of the differences, one difference in delayed learning and memory is statistically significant. But the effects for bipolar disorder are around the mean, they're around the control mean. So in most domains, first episode bipolar disorder is not showing cognitive deficits. If you look at more chronic bipolar disorder, then the deficits are often more marked. But in terms of first episode, then we're not really seeing a deficit picture. And in fact, some of the information from birth cohort studies, such as the Dunedin study in New Zealand, indicates that the pre-morbid intelligence of people with bipolar disorder is relatively high, is higher than the mean. So at onset, bipolar disorder is much less of a cognitive disorder than schizophrenia, certainly according to these figures. So here's an area, certainly from the ESOP study, where again there were differences, big differences between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. So some similarities in the epidemiology, some differences in the epidemiology, a big difference in terms of cognition. So as Guy Goodwin says, schizophrenia is like having a head injury as well as psychosis. Bipolar disorder is not. And of course, in schizophrenia, a lot of the disability, the poor outcome, is driven by cognition, whereas perhaps in bipolar disorder, a lot of the disability is driven more by the mood disorder itself. Symptoms in schizophrenia don't really drive outcome. In fact, I know a psychiatrist who has quite bad schizophrenia with lots of hallucinations and symptoms, but she's able to practice, which is a very clear example of symptoms not being the rate limiting step in schizophrenia. It's the cognitive deficit. So that was a tour of some of the information that we have been able to find out about bipolar disorder in the ESOP study. A lot of it is hidden in different papers, which are mainly about schizophrenia. And as I say, we do that not only because many of the researchers are mainly schizophrenia researchers, but because the bipolar groups are often very, very small or relatively small. And there are some interesting differences between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and some interesting similarities. And perhaps in a few years' time, I'll be able to come back and tell you about this 10-year follow-up that we've just completed, and there'll be another set of similarities and differences between schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So lastly, to say that I've been standing here telling you about work done by many other people, and here are some of them, and if you click that link you'll see about 50 people's names who've been involved in this study. So thank you very much for listening.